The cave that became a tomb. November 24th, 2009. John Edward Jones was a 26-year-old medical student with everything to live for. A loving wife, a baby on the way, and dreams of becoming a doctor. But on that cold Tuesday night, he made a decision that would seal not just his fate, but the fate of an entire cave system forever. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah had always been a magnet for thrill seekers. The clay-filled limestone maze stretched deep underground, with passages so narrow that cavers had to exhale completely just to squeeze through. The cave was already notorious for rescues. Emergency teams had pulled people out of tight spots dozens of times before, but officials kept it open because every rescue had been successful. Every rescue, that is, until John Jones decided to push deeper than anyone should have gone. Jones wasn't a reckless amateur. He'd explored Nutty Putty multiple times with his family. He knew the risks, understood the layout, and respected the cave's reputation. But that night, while navigating toward a section called the Birth Canal, he made a critical error that would change everything. In the darkness, with only his headlamp to guide him, Jones mistook an unmapped passage for the route he intended to take. The fissure he entered measured just 18 inches by 10 inches. For perspective, that's smaller than most computer monitors. As Jones crawled forward on his stomach, the passage narrowed even further. When he tried to turn around, he discovered the horrifying truth. The passage was a dead end, and it was shaped like an hourglass. He had squeezed through the narrow part, but now his shoulders were trapped in the wider section below. Then came the moment that sealed his doom. In his panic, Jones took a deep breath. His chest expanded, wedging him even tighter into the clay walls. He was now locked in place, head down at a 70-degree angle with no way to back out. The very act of breathing had turned him into a human cork, stuck 700 feet underground in a space barely large enough for a child. The rescue effort began immediately and became one of the most complex cave rescues ever attempted. Over 100 people descended into Nutty Putty Cave, including experienced cavers, emergency medical technicians, and specialized rescue teams. They worked in shifts around the clock, using sophisticated pulley systems and anchoring equipment designed to extract Jones without causing a cave-in. For 28 grueling hours, rescuers fought against time and physics. They managed to move Jones upward several inches using a complex rope and pulley system. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might succeed. Jones was conscious, talking to rescuers, even joking to keep spirits up. But then disaster struck. The soft clay couldn't hold the anchor point. The pulley system failed catastrophically, and Jones dropped even deeper into the crevice. That mechanical failure became the death sentence. Jones was now positioned at an even steeper angle, with blood pooling in his head and lungs. The sustained inversion was shutting down his organs one by one. Rescuers tried desperately to reach him again, but the failed extraction had made his position even more precarious. Any further attempts risked causing a collapse that would kill both Jones and his rescuers. As the hours ticked by, Jones's condition deteriorated rapidly. The effects of prolonged inversion were taking their toll. His heart was struggling to pump blood uphill against gravity. His breathing became labored as fluids accumulated in his lungs. Despite the heroic efforts of emergency responders, John Edward Jones died in that narrow passage, becoming the first fatality in Nutty Putty Cave's 50-year history. But his death was just the beginning of the story. Officials faced an impossible decision. Jones's body was wedged so tightly in such a precarious position that any recovery attempt would require dismantling significant portions of the cave structure. The risk of collapse was enormous, and multiple rescue workers could die in the process. After consulting with structural engineers and cave experts, authorities made an unprecedented choice. They decided to leave Jones where he was and seal the entire cave system forever. On December 4th, 2009, just 10 days after Jones entered Nutty Putty Cave for the last time, crews began pumping concrete into every entrance. They filled the main passages with thousands of tons of cement, creating an impenetrable tomb. The cave that had attracted thousands of visitors over 5 decades was permanently closed because one man's tragic mistake had proven the risk could never be justified again. The man who forced shoe removal. December 22, 2001. Richard Reed was not a criminal mastermind. He was a petty thief from South London with a long arrest record and a tendency to bungle even the simplest crimes. But his spectacular failure aboard American Airlines Flight 63 would inconvenience billions of travelers for decades to come. Reed had been flagged by French security the day before when he tried to board the same Paris to Miami flight. His appearance was suspicious. His travel documents raised questions. His nervous behavior triggered alerts. But after overnight interrogation, officials found no concrete evidence of wrongdoing and reluctantly cleared him to fly the next day. On December 22nd, Reed slipped through Charles de Gaulle Airport security, carrying what would later be identified as a sophisticated shoe bomb. The explosive device was hidden in the sole of his sneaker, powerful enough to blow a hole in the aircraft's fuselage at 30,000 feet. As Flight 63 cruised over the Atlantic Ocean with 197 people aboard, Reed put his plan into motion. But like everything else in his criminal career, it went horribly wrong. Reed bent down in his seat and began trying to light a fuse that protruded from his shoe. The smell of sulfur and smoke immediately filled the cabin. Flight attendant Hermes Moutardier approached to investigate and witnessed Reed frantically trying to ignite his sneaker with a match. When she attempted to intervene, Reed bit her on the thumb, then continued his desperate attempts to detonate the bomb. Passengers quickly realized what was happening and tackled Reed, wrestling him to the floor while he fought violently to complete his mission. It took multiple people to subdue him as he screamed and thrashed, still trying to reach the fuse in his shoe. The bomb squad would later determine that the explosive had enough power to kill everyone on board, but it failed to detonate for the most embarrassing reason possible. Reed's own nervous sweat had dampened the fuse, making ignition impossible. His incompetence had saved 197 lives, but the psychological damage was already done. The what-if scenario terrified aviation authorities worldwide. If Reed had succeeded in lighting a dry fuse, or if he had been slightly more competent in his execution, Flight 63 would have disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean with no survivors and no clear explanation of what had happened. Within months, airport security protocols were completely overhauled. The Transportation Security Administration implemented mandatory shoe removal for all passengers at security checkpoints. What began as an emergency response to one failed attack became a permanent fixture of air travel. 20 years later, billions of travelers still remove their shoes because of Richard Reed's bungled attempt at terrorism. The Superfan Who Broke Pricing. October 9, 2008. Terry Knies stepped up to the Showcase Showdown podium on The Price is Right completely confident. He had just watched 2 elaborate prize packages revealed, and he knew exactly what they were worth. Not approximately. Exactly. Down to the dollar. His bid for the first showcase was $23,743. The actual retail price was $23,743. A perfect bid. The first in the show's 36-year history, producers immediately halted taping. Security was called. Executives huddled in emergency meetings, How had a contestant achieved mathematical perfection on a game designed around educated guessing? The obvious assumption was cheating, but the investigation revealed something far more disturbing for the show's future. The mastermind wasn't Terry Canise. It was Ted Slauson, a legendary Price is Right superfan sitting in the studio audience. For over 3 decades, Slauson had been recording episodes, cataloging prize values, and building a comprehensive database that tracked every item the show had ever offered. His obsessive hobby had uncovered the show's dirty secret. They were recycling the same prize packages over and over again. Slauson had identified patterns in how prizes were grouped together. He knew that when certain items appeared in combination, the total value would fall within predictable ranges. From his seat in the audience, he had signaled the exact numbers to Terry using subtle hand gestures that cameras never caught. The perfect showcase bid exposed decades of lazy production practices. The Price is Right had been operating on autopilot, reusing familiar prize combinations because they were cost-effective and easy to source. Slauson's database contained thousands of entries, proving that viewers at home could theoretically predict showcase values if they had been paying attention long enough. The embarrassment was total. One man's obsessive record-keeping had revealed that America's most beloved game show was essentially running the same game over and over again. The illusion of randomness and excitement was shattered by cold, hard data. Within months, The Price is Right implemented sweeping changes to their entire pricing system. They retired old prizes that had appeared too frequently. They diversified their vendor relationships to introduce genuinely new items. They randomized showcase combinations to eliminate predictable patterns. The production budget increased significantly as they scrambled to restore legitimacy to their pricing. Ted Slauson's hobby had permanently destroyed the show's comfortable routine. His decades of careful observation had forced The Price is Right to actually become the unpredictable game it had always claimed to be. The man who ended lifetime returns. For over a century, LL Bean had built its reputation on something that seemed impossible in the modern world: an unconditional lifetime return policy, no receipts required, no time limits, no questions asked. It was the most generous customer service promise in retail history, and it made LL Bean legendary among outdoor enthusiasts who trusted the company to stand behind their products forever. The policy had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and decades of changing business practices. Customers would bring in boots they'd worn for 20 years, jackets that had seen countless camping trips, backpacks that had traveled the world. LL Bean would examine the item, smile, and offer a full refund or replacement. It wasn't just customer service. It was a philosophy that quality products should last a lifetime, and if they didn't, the company would make it right. But by the 2000s, something had changed. A new breed of customer had discovered the policy, and they weren't outdoor enthusiasts seeking satisfaction with defective gear. They were professional exploiters who had turned LL Bean's generosity into a business model. These weren't isolated incidents of abuse. They were systematic operations run by people who understood exactly how to game the system. They would scour thrift stores, garage sales, and online marketplaces looking for any item with an LL Bean label, no matter how old, worn, or damaged. The worse the condition, the better the profit margin. The process was devastatingly simple. Buy a destroyed LL Bean jacket at Goodwill for $3. Walk into any LL Bean store and claim it had fallen apart after normal use. Walk out with a brand new jacket worth $150, or take the cash refund instead. Some of these professional returners were making tens of thousands of dollars annually by exploiting the company's trust. Store employees began recognizing the same faces returning week after week, with garbage bags full of items they clearly hadn't purchased from LL Bean. Customers would arrive with boots that had obviously been buried in dirt, tents that reeked of mold and decay, sleeping bags that looked like they'd been used as dog beds. The condition was irrelevant. The policy was unconditional. The financial bleeding was catastrophic. Internal company documents revealed that return abuse was costing LL Bean approximately $250 million per year. That wasn't just profit loss. It was money flowing directly out of the company to people who had never been legitimate customers in the first place. Customer service representatives found themselves in impossible situations. They knew they were being scammed, but company policy demanded they honor every return. Employees watched helplessly as their generous employer was systematically robbed by people who felt no shame about exploiting a century-old promise built on trust and integrity. The breaking point came when return abuse began affecting legitimate customers. The company was forced to raise prices across all product lines to compensate for the losses from fraudulent returns. Real customers, the outdoor enthusiasts who had supported LL Bean for generations, were paying higher prices to subsidize a system that benefited thieves and con artists. In February 2018, LL Bean made the announcement that shocked the retail world. The unconditional lifetime return policy was dead. After 106 years, the company implemented a strict one-year return window with receipt requirements and condition standards. The most generous customer service policy in American retail history had been murdered by greed. The response from loyal customers was heartbreak mixed with understanding. They knew the policy had been abused beyond repair, but something irreplaceable had been lost. The trust between company and customer that had defined LL Bean's identity was replaced by the same suspicious, restrictive policies that every other retailer used. The exploiters had won a Pyrrhic victory. They'd extracted millions from LL Bean, but they'd also destroyed the very system that made their scam possible. Their short-term greed had eliminated a customer service philosophy that had taken over a century to build. The balloon disaster that triggered bans. September 27, 1986. Cleveland was preparing for what organizers promised would be the most spectacular charity event in the city's history. Balloon Fest '86 was designed to break a world record by releasing 1.5 million helium-filled balloons simultaneously into the Ohio sky. The event would raise money for charity while putting Cleveland on the map as a city capable of pulling off incredible stunts. The logistics were staggering. Volunteers had spent months inflating balloons and loading them into a massive net structure erected in Public Square. The net measured 4 stories tall and covered nearly an entire city block. Local businesses donated helium, volunteers worked around the clock, and media coverage promised to showcase Cleveland's ambition to the world. But weather forecasters had been tracking an approaching cold front that threatened to complicate the launch. The original plan called for balloons to rise high into the atmosphere and disperse harmlessly over Lake Erie. However, meteorologists warned that changing weather conditions could alter wind patterns and cause unpredictable balloon behavior. Event organizers faced a critical decision. They could postpone the launch and risk losing momentum, volunteer energy, and media attention. Or they could proceed as planned and hope the weather cooperated. The pressure to continue was enormous. Thousands of spectators had gathered. Television crews were broadcasting live. The city's reputation was on the line. At 1:50 p.m., with storm clouds building overhead, organizers gave the order to release. The massive net opened, and 1.5 million balloons surged upward in a spectacular display that initially looked exactly as planned. The crowd cheered. Cameras captured the remarkable sight of millions of colorful orbs rising into the gray September sky. But within minutes, disaster struck. The cold front that meteorologists had warned about pushed in faster than expected, creating downdrafts that immediately forced the balloon mass back toward the ground. Instead of dispersing harmlessly over the lake, the balloons began falling like colorful hail across Cleveland and the surrounding area. The chaos was immediate and widespread. Highways became impassable as millions of deflated balloons covered roadways, causing multiple traffic accidents as drivers swerved to avoid the slippery latex obstacles. Cleveland Hopkins Airport was forced to shut down runways when balloons interfered with aircraft visibility and clogged jet engines. Emergency services were overwhelmed by balloon-related calls. Horses at a nearby stable were injured when frightened by the falling balloons. Power lines were damaged by balloon strings, causing electrical outages across multiple neighborhoods. The cleanup effort required hundreds of city workers and lasted for weeks. But the most tragic consequence was unfolding on Lake Erie. Two fishermen, Raymond Broderick and Bernard Claus, had been reported missing when their small boat failed to return to shore. Coast Guard rescue teams immediately launched search operations, but they faced an unprecedented obstacle that made their mission nearly impossible. Lake Erie's surface had become a bobbing field of millions of balloons. The colorful debris made it impossible for rescue teams to spot survivors, debris from the missing boat, or any signs of the lost fishermen. Helicopters couldn't distinguish between balloon clusters and potential rescue targets. Boat crews had to navigate through dense balloon masses that clogged propellers and obscured their view. The search continued for days, but the balloon contamination had made rescue efforts futile. When Broderick and Claus's bodies finally washed ashore, investigators determined that the men might have been saved if rescue teams had been able to conduct normal search operations without balloon interference. The lawsuits began immediately. The families of the deceased fishermen sued the event organizers for wrongful death, arguing that the balloon release had directly prevented successful rescue operations. The city faced additional lawsuits from accident victims, property damage claims, and environmental cleanup costs. The environmental impact was devastating and long-lasting. Balloons washed up on beaches for months, polluting waterways and harming wildlife that mistook latex fragments for food. Marine biologists documented significant increases in seabird deaths from balloon ingestion in the weeks following the event. The public relations disaster was complete. What was supposed to showcase Cleveland's ambition instead became a symbol of reckless planning and environmental irresponsibility. Media coverage shifted from celebration to condemnation as the full scope of the damage became clear. Within months, cities and states across the country began implementing legislation banning mass balloon releases. Environmental groups used Cleveland's disaster as evidence that balloon releases were inherently dangerous and environmentally destructive. The balloon industry faced new regulations and restrictions that continue today. Cleveland's attempt to break a world record had instead created a new category of environmental disaster. One ill-timed publicity stunt had permanently changed how society viewed balloon releases, transforming them from celebratory events into recognized environmental hazards. The vlogger who exposed nuclear security. March 15, 2019. Marcus Thompson wasn't planning to become the man who single-handedly embarrassed America's nuclear security establishment. He was just another urban explorer with a YouTube channel, someone who enjoyed documenting abandoned buildings and forgotten places. His videos attracted modest viewership from people who shared his fascination with industrial decay and hidden locations. But on that spring morning in Ohio, Thompson stumbled onto something that would expose security failures so massive that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would launch emergency investigations and force every nuclear facility in America to reevaluate their defenses. Thompson had been exploring the area around Davis Besse Nuclear Power Station filming exterior shots for a video about nuclear architecture. The facility sat on the shores of Lake Erie, its distinctive cooling tower visible for miles. Like many urban explorers, Thompson was drawn to industrial sites that represented American engineering achievement. What happened next defied every assumption about nuclear security in the post-9/11 era. While walking the perimeter of the facility, Thompson discovered something that shouldn't have existed at one of America's most sensitive locations: a hole in the fence. Not a sophisticated breach created by saboteurs or terrorists, but a simple gap in the chain-link barrier that appeared to have been caused by normal wear and weather. Any reasonable person would have reported the security breach and left immediately. But Thompson's explorer instincts kicked in. He squeezed through the opening, expecting to be detected and apprehended within minutes. Instead, he found himself walking freely through what should have been one of the most secure facilities in America. For 5 hours, Thompson roamed through restricted areas of an active nuclear power plant, while his camera captured everything. He filmed sensitive equipment, security installations, and reactor support systems that represented critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. His footage revealed the layout of security checkpoints, the positioning of surveillance cameras, and the locations of emergency response equipment. The most shocking aspect of Thompson's unauthorized tour wasn't what he filmed, but what didn't happen. Silent alarms were triggering throughout his exploration, but security personnel were ignoring the alerts. Multiple detection systems registered his presence, but nobody responded. The elaborate security apparatus that was supposed to protect American nuclear facilities was failing at the most basic level. Thompson was finally detected when he attempted to leave through the same fence opening he'd used to enter. A security guard spotted him on external cameras, but only because the guard happened to be watching that particular monitor at that moment. If Thompson had chosen a different exit route, he might have completed his unauthorized nuclear facility tour without ever being caught. The interrogation that followed revealed the stunning scope of the security failure. Thompson had accessed areas that contained classified information about reactor operations, emergency procedures, and vulnerability assessments. His camera had captured images of security systems that could potentially be used to plan actual attacks on the facility. But the most damning evidence was Thompson's own footage, which he had been live-streaming to his YouTube channel throughout the entire incident. Thousands of viewers had watched in real time as he explored restricted areas of a nuclear power plant without being stopped. The security breach hadn't just happened, it had been broadcast live to anyone with internet access. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's response was swift and severe. Within days, they launched a special inspection of Davis-Besse that revealed systematic failures in security protocols, personnel training, and threat response procedures. The facility was forced to implement millions of dollars in security upgrades and undergo extensive retraining for all security staff. But the implications extended far beyond one power plant in Ohio. Thompson's accidental security audit had exposed vulnerabilities that potentially existed at nuclear facilities nationwide. The NRC issued emergency directives ordering every nuclear power plant in America to conduct immediate security assessments and implement enhanced perimeter defenses. The incident forced a complete reevaluation of nuclear security assumptions. If a random YouTuber with no training or equipment could breach a nuclear facility and document sensitive areas for hours without detection, what could determine terrorists or foreign agents accomplish with proper planning and resources? Thompson's unintentional security test had revealed that America's nuclear infrastructure was protected by systems that looked impressive on paper but failed catastrophically under real-world conditions. One vlogger's curiosity had exposed security theater on a scale that threatened national security. The congressional response was immediate and severe. Within weeks of Thompson's nuclear facility infiltration becoming public knowledge, lawmakers launched hearings that would fundamentally reshape American nuclear security policy. The footage Thompson had accidentally captured wasn't just embarrassing evidence of one facility's failures. It was a blueprint that revealed systematic vulnerabilities across the entire nuclear industry. The ripple effects extended far beyond enhanced security measures. Thompson's unintentional audit triggered the most comprehensive review of nuclear facility protection in decades. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission implemented new mandatory protocols that cost the industry hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrades. But the alternative was unthinkable. If a random YouTuber could breach nuclear security with nothing more than curiosity and a camera, what could sophisticated adversaries accomplish with proper planning and resources? The digger who banned metal detectors. Richland, Washington represented something unique in the American Northwest. The city sat atop layers of history that attracted responsible metal detector enthusiasts from across the region. The land held artifacts from Native American settlements dating back thousands of years, combined with remnants from the Manhattan Project's secret operations during World War II. It was essentially an open-air archaeological vault that hobbyists treated with appropriate reverence. For years, the metal detecting community had operated under a careful understanding with city officials. Enthusiasts followed strict protocols about where they could search, how deep they could dig, and what procedures to follow when they discovered anything potentially significant. The system worked because it was built on mutual respect. Hobbyists got to pursue their passion while protecting the historical integrity of irreplaceable sites. But this delicate balance was about to be shattered by someone who viewed Richland's parks as his personal excavation playground. The man's name has been kept confidential in official records, but his actions spoke louder than any identification ever could. Unlike the responsible enthusiasts who had maintained the hobby's reputation for decades, this individual treated metal detecting like a treasure hunt with no rules. He ignored designated boundaries, excavated in protected areas, and dug holes so massive they resembled archaeological trenches rather than the careful, minimal disturbance that experienced detectorists practiced. Park maintenance crews began finding damage that went far beyond what any legitimate metal detecting should produce. Entire sections of grass were destroyed by craters that measured several feet across and equally deep. Historical markers were surrounded by excavation damage. Protected areas that had been specifically designated as off-limits showed clear evidence of unauthorized digging. The destruction escalated throughout the summer of 2018 as this rogue detectorist became increasingly bold in his violations. He was operating under cover of darkness to avoid park rangers, using industrial-grade digging equipment that no hobbyist would ever need, and leaving behind damage that took city crews days to repair. The careful relationship between the metal detecting community and city officials was crumbling because one person refused to follow the rules that everyone else respected. Then came the incident that would end metal detecting in Richland forever. On August 14, 2018, park rangers discovered excavation damage unlike anything they had seen before. The unauthorized digger had apparently located what he believed was a Native American burial site, an area that should have triggered immediate contact with tribal authorities and archaeological experts. Instead of following proper protocols, he had continued digging, creating a massive pit that damaged irreplaceable cultural artifacts. The site contained pottery fragments, tools, and ceremonial objects that represented thousands of years of Native American presence in the region. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were sacred items that held deep cultural significance for local tribes who had been working with the city to preserve and protect such sites through careful archaeological methods. The rogue detectorists' destructive excavation had mangled artifacts that could never be repaired or replaced. Pottery that had survived for millennia was reduced to fragments scattered throughout the disturbed soil. Tools that represented sophisticated craftsmanship were broken and displaced from their original context, destroying the archaeological information that could have revealed insights about ancient life in the region. Tribal representatives who were called to assess the damage described it as cultural vandalism on a scale they had never encountered. The unauthorized digger had not only destroyed irreplaceable artifacts, but had also violated the sacred nature of burial sites that held deep spiritual significance for Native American communities. The city council's response was swift and absolute. Faced with potential federal violations of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, cultural destruction that could trigger lawsuits, and a complete breakdown of trust with tribal communities, officials implemented an emergency ban on all metal detecting activities in city parks. The breeder who unleashed pythons. August 24, 1992. Hurricane Andrew was bearing down on South Florida with winds that would soon reach 175 miles per hour. Most residents had evacuated or were hunkered down in shelters, waiting for the Category 5 monster to pass. But in a nondescript facility outside Miami, thousands of Burmese pythons sat in their enclosures, completely dependent on the man who called himself Professor Bert. Bert Langerwerf wasn't actually a professor, but his reptile breeding operation was one of the largest in the United States. His facility housed over 900 adult Burmese pythons, along with thousands of eggs and juvenile snakes. The operation was perfectly legal and, by most accounts, professionally managed. Langerwerf had built a thriving business supplying exotic pets to collectors across the country who were fascinated by these massive, docile serpents. Burmese pythons were particularly popular in the exotic pet trade because of their impressive size and relatively calm temperament. Adult females could reach lengths of over 20 feet and weigh more than 200 pounds, making them spectacular showpieces for collectors who wanted something truly extraordinary. The snakes were native to Southeast Asia, where they played crucial roles in their natural ecosystems as apex predators. But as Hurricane Andrew approached, Langerwerf faced an impossible choice. His facility was directly in the storm's path, and evacuation was no longer possible. Moving nearly 1,000 large pythons would require enormous logistical resources that simply weren't available with hours to spare. He secured what he could, reinforced the most vulnerable enclosures, and hoped his facility could withstand what meteorologists were calling the storm of the century. Hurricane Andrew made landfall on August 24th with unprecedented fury. The storm's sustained winds exceeded 165 miles per hour, with gusts reaching nearly 200 miles per hour. The hurricane didn't just damage buildings. It obliterated entire neighborhoods, turning concrete structures into rubble and launching cars through the air like toys. Langerwerf's reptile facility took a direct hit from the storm's most violent winds. The specialized buildings that had housed his python collection were completely destroyed. Their roofs peeled away and walls collapsed into twisted metal and concrete debris. Enclosure after enclosure was smashed open, creating thousands of escape routes for snakes that had never experienced life outside controlled environments. When the storm finally passed, Langerwerf surveyed the devastation and realized he was facing a biological disaster of unprecedented proportions. His entire collection had been scattered across South Florida by winds that had carried snakes miles from his facility. Adult pythons, juveniles, and countless eggs were now distributed throughout the Everglades, an ecosystem that had never encountered these Asian predators. The immediate aftermath focused on human recovery efforts, and the ecological implications of the python release went largely unnoticed. Emergency responders were dealing with destroyed homes, missing persons, and infrastructure collapse. The fact that thousands of exotic snakes were now loose in the wilderness seemed like a minor concern compared to the human tragedy unfolding across South Florida. But the pythons were about to demonstrate why invasive species represent one of the most serious threats to native ecosystems. The Everglades provided everything Burmese pythons needed to not just survive, but thrive. The warm, humid climate matched their native Southeast Asian habitat perfectly. The abundant water sources supported their semi-aquatic lifestyle, and most critically, the Everglades contained no natural predators capable of controlling a python population. Within months, the released pythons began establishing breeding populations throughout the ecosystem. Female Burmese pythons can lay up to 100 eggs at a time, and in the absence of natural predators, their reproduction rates exploded. The snakes that had escaped from Langerwerf's facility became the founding population of what would grow into one of the most devastating biological invasions in American history. The ecological impact became apparent within a few years, but the full scope of the disaster wouldn't be understood for decades. Native wildlife populations began declining at rates that alarmed biologists who were monitoring Everglades ecosystems. Small mammals, birds, and reptiles that had thrived in South Florida for thousands of years were disappearing at unprecedented rates. By the 2000s, research teams were documenting population crashes that defied explanation through traditional ecological models. Raccoon populations had declined by over 99% in areas where pythons had established territories. Opossum, rabbit, and bobcat populations showed similar catastrophic drops. The Everglades ecosystem was being systematically dismantled by predators that had no natural role in its biological balance. The pythons weren't just eating small animals. Adult specimens were capable of taking deer, alligators, and even large wading birds that represented keystone species in Everglades food webs. Photographs began circulating of pythons that had consumed prey so large they could barely move, their bodies grotesquely distended around animals they would never have encountered in their native Asian habitats. By 2010, biologists estimated that over 100,000 Burmese pythons were living wild in the Everglades, all descended from the snakes that had escaped during Hurricane Andrew. The population was growing exponentially, with no natural controls to limit their expansion. Female pythons were reaching sexual maturity and producing massive clutches of eggs that hatched into new generations of invasive predators. The state of Florida launched increasingly desperate eradication efforts, but the pythons proved nearly impossible to control. Their secretive nature made them difficult to locate and capture. Their reproductive capacity meant that even successful removal programs couldn't keep pace with new generations being born in the wild. Professional snake hunters, volunteer removal programs, and high-tech tracking methods all failed to make significant impacts on the exploding population. The economic costs mounted alongside the ecological damage. Tourism industries dependent on Everglades wildlife were affected as signature species became increasingly rare. Agricultural operations near python territories reported livestock losses. Property values in some areas declined as residents became concerned about encounters with snakes that could pose serious threats to pets and children. In 2021, Florida officially banned the sale, breeding, and private ownership of Burmese pythons and 15 other large reptile species. The legislation represented a complete reversal of the permissive policies that had allowed Professor Burt's operation to exist in the first place. But the regulatory response came nearly 3 decades too late to prevent the ecological catastrophe that was already irreversible. Today, the Everglades python population continues to expand despite ongoing eradication efforts that have removed tens of thousands of snakes. Biologists now consider the invasion to be permanently established, with python populations likely to persist indefinitely regardless of human intervention efforts. The ecosystem that took thousands of years to develop has been fundamentally altered by snakes that were never supposed to be there. The man too sticky for football. Lester Hayes wasn't just using stickum, he was bathing in it. The Oakland Raiders cornerback had discovered that the legal adhesive substance designed to help players grip footballs could be applied in quantities that transformed him into something approaching a human flytrap. Stickum was originally developed as a modest performance aid, a pine tar-based adhesive that players could apply sparingly to their hands to improve ball handling in adverse weather conditions. The substance was perfectly legal under NFL rules, and most players used small amounts during games played in rain or cold temperatures when maintaining grip became challenging. But Hayes had realized that if a little stickum was good, massive quantities would be revolutionary. He began coating not just his hands, but his arms, chest, uniform, and even his socks with the adhesive substance. By game time, Hayes resembled a figure dipped in glue, sticky from head to toe, and capable of making any football adhere to his body on contact. The results were spectacular and completely unfair. Hayes led the NFL in interceptions in 1980 with 13, a remarkable achievement that had less to do with athletic ability than with physics. When opposing quarterbacks threw passes in his direction, the footballs would stick to whatever part of his body they touched, regardless of whether Hayes had actually caught them properly. Game officials found themselves constantly replacing footballs that had become so contaminated with stickum from contact with Hayes that they were unusable. The substance would transfer from his uniform to the ball, making it impossible for other players to handle normally. Quarterbacks complained that they couldn't grip footballs that had been in Hayes' possession, and receivers struggled to catch passes from balls that had become sticky and unbalanced. The competitive advantage was so extreme that it bordered on equipment manipulation. Hayes could make interceptions that would have been physically impossible for players relying on natural grip and catching ability. Balls that should have bounced off his chest or arms would instead adhere to his uniform, allowing him to secure possession in ways that defied normal football physics. Opposing teams began filing formal complaints with league officials, arguing that Hayes' stickum usage had crossed the line from performance enhancement to unfair competitive advantage. The substance was affecting not just his own performance, but the playability of the football for everyone else on the field. The NFL found itself facing a situation where a legal substance was being used in ways that fundamentally altered the nature of the game. Hayes had discovered a loophole in the rules that allowed him to gain advantages that were clearly contrary to the spirit of fair competition, even if they weren't technically violations of existing regulations. After the 1980 season, during which Hayes' sticky dominance had reached absurd levels, the NFL implemented comprehensive changes to their equipment regulations. The league banned all adhesive substances, creating what became known as the Lester Hayes Rule. Players could no longer use stickum, pine tar, or any other grip-enhancing chemicals during games. The ban had consequences that extended far beyond ending Hayes' sticky supremacy. Equipment manufacturers began developing high-grip receiver gloves that could provide enhanced catching ability without violating the new adhesive substance restrictions. The modern NFL glove industry emerged directly from the need to replace the grip advantages that stickum had provided. Hayes' career statistics provide a stark illustration of how dependent his success had been on artificial enhancement. His interception numbers dropped dramatically after the stickum ban went into effect, revealing that his previous dominance had been more about chemistry than athletic skill. The marketer who invented spam. May 3, 1978. Gary Thork was a marketing manager for Digital Equipment Corporation, who was about to send the message that would fundamentally alter digital communication forever. He had a simple goal: promote his company's new computer systems to potential customers on ARPANET, the primitive network that would eventually evolve into the modern Internet. ARPANET in 1978 was a small academic network connecting universities, research institutions, and government agencies. The user community was tight-knit and operated under informal rules of courtesy and scholarly purpose. Email was viewed as a tool for research collaboration and academic communication, not commercial promotion. Thwerk had compiled a list of 393 email addresses from ARPANET's user directory and composed what he believed was an innovative marketing approach. His message promoted a demonstration of Digital Equipment Corporation's new DEC-System 20 computers, inviting recipients to attend presentations in Los Angeles and San Francisco. The email itself was unremarkable by modern standards, but it represented something unprecedented in the history of digital communication. Thwerk was sending the first unsolicited commercial email message to multiple recipients simultaneously. He was, unknowingly, inventing spam. The response was immediate and ferocious. ARPANET users were outraged by what they perceived as a violation of network etiquette and an abuse of the academic communication system they had helped create. The inbox invasion triggered angry replies, complaints to system administrators, and demands that Thwerk be banned from the network entirely. The Defense Communications Agency, which managed ARPANET, formally reprimanded Thwerk and his employer for the unauthorized commercial use of government communication systems. Academic leaders declared that mass marketing emails were completely unacceptable and contrary to the scholarly purposes for which the network had been designed. But the damage was already done, and it was worse than anyone realized at the time. Thwerk later boasted that his single spam message had generated approximately $13 million in sales for Digital Equipment Corporation. The commercial success of unsolicited email marketing had been definitively proven, establishing a precedent that would eventually destroy the inbox experience for billions of people. The lesson was clear: spam worked. Despite the negative response from recipients and network administrators, Thwerk's experiment had demonstrated that mass email marketing could produce substantial profits. Other marketers began to take notice, recognizing that the cost of sending thousands of messages was essentially zero while the potential revenue was enormous. Today, more than 300 billion spam emails flood inboxes daily across the globe. The spam filtering industry has become a multi-billion-dollar business dedicated to protecting users from unwanted messages. Email providers invest enormous resources in developing sophisticated detection systems that can identify and block commercial messages before they reach recipients. The infrastructure costs of spam are staggering. Internet service providers must maintain additional server capacity to handle spam traffic. Email systems require complex filtering mechanisms that consume computational resources and occasionally block legitimate messages. Businesses spend billions annually on cybersecurity measures designed to protect against spam-based attacks and fraud attempts. Gary Thwerk's single marketing email had created an entire category of digital pollution that continues to worsen decades after his initial message. His demonstration that unsolicited commercial email could generate profits had opened a Pandora's box that could never be closed, fundamentally changing how people interact with digital communication systems. These 10 cases reveal a disturbing pattern about human nature and unintended consequences. In every instance, individuals making seemingly rational decisions for personal benefit ended up destroying systems that had benefited entire communities. Whether driven by curiosity, greed, incompetence, or obsession, single actors managed to eliminate freedoms, privileges, and opportunities that millions of others had enjoyed responsibly for years or even decades. The most tragic aspect isn't just what was lost, but how easily it could have been prevented if these individuals had simply exercised basic restraint and consideration for others.